Okay, let's take a look at a common objection to virtue ethics. We've been studying up to this point in the semester, um, several normative theories, we've covered so far, but two of the big ones have been deontology and utilitarianism. And for a long time in modern Western academic philosophy, those were basically the two big camps in moral theory. In the 1980s, with the publication of a book by Alistair McIntyre called After Virtue, um, virtue ethics started getting new proponents, some contemporary proponents again, with the publication of that book. And then kind of what people sometimes call a revival of virtue ethics in contemporary philosophy. And so a lot this semester, we've been looking at, these thought experiments like the murder at the door thought experiment that we've covered previously. Imagine you've borrowed a chainsaw from a friend, promising to return it when he asks for it. Imagine he turns up at your door visibly drunken state, accompanied by a bound and gagged companion who's already been severely beaten and is in a state of terror. I'll have my chainsaw now. Um, ought you return the chainsaw in those circumstances, right? So we've looked at, how deontology would try to address that question with the simplified universalizability test, where we identify the maxim of our action in that scenario, see if that maxim can be universalized. If it generates a contradiction, then we're obligated. Then it's impermissible, right, for us to act on it like a negative obligation. If it doesn't have a contradiction in it, either a formal contradiction or a contradiction of the will, it's at very least permissible for us to act on that maxim. So you have promise breaking or promise keeping maxims that you would be worried about in that murder at the door scenario, and then perform that universalizability test. If you're a utilitarian, as we've learned, you have to conduct a kind of hedonic calculus, a basic hedonic calculus, at least for the classical utilitarians, to figure out which of the possible courses of action you might take has the highest expected utility, and then you're obligated to perform that action. So the murder at the door scenario is a pretty easy one for something like act utilitarianism. Obviously, saving the life is going to have more happiness and better benefits than a person ending up dead. So, you break the promise in that scenario. Uh, and in the virtue ethics, as we've seen, it doesn't operate on the greatest happiness principle, which talks about, right action in proportion to the consequences of the action being maximizing utility, or whether there's an internal coherence to the maxim so that it can be willed as a universal law. In deontology, with the categorical imperative, act only on those maxims that you can will as a universal law, or treat humanity and yourself or in others always as a end in itself and never as a mere means. So we had those, kind of decision procedures that we were derived from the greatest happiness principle or deontology's categorical imperative. Well, with virtue ethics, as we've learned, that approach to moral philosophy takes a very different approach. It begins with the question, what ought I do? What kind of person should I be? As opposed to what ought I do? Or, a much broader question about what character traits we're going to have, or how should I live, right? A much broader question. And then Aristotle poses this golden mean to help us identify the virtues. So a virtue is a state of deliberate moral purpose consisting in a mean relative to ourselves, the mean being determined by reason, or as a prudent man would determine it, what Aristotle calls the phronesis, the wise person that has practical wisdom. It's a mean firstly lying between two vices, the vices of excess on the one hand and the vices of deficiency on the other. And then, as we learned last week, we have this big chart of virtues and vices, but we don't seem to get anything like a decision procedure, like a universalizability test or a utility calculation from the golden mean. And because of that, some contemporary philosophers, often from either those who are skeptical of any moral theory, like my example of this particular objection coming up from Mackey, or critics that hold maybe a deontological or a utilitarian point of view, fault virtue ethics for not being able to guide action in cases like the murder at the door or our trolley problem. So let's take a look at this objection. We're going to call it the indeterminacy or the no clear standard objection, because the idea of this objection is that it leaves virtue ethics leaves us with an indeterminate course of action. It doesn't tell us, it doesn't determine for us a standard that could tell us what to do and guide our conduct, help us distinguish between permissible and impermissible or obligatory actions. At best, it just helps us pick out virtues compared to vices with that mean. So here's how Mackey, who we covered earlier in the semester for his error theory, here's how he levels the objection against virtue ethics. In reference to the golden mean and phronesis, he says, as a guide about what is the good life, what precisely one ought to do, or even by what one standard should try to decide what to do, this is too circular to be very helpful. And although Aristotle's account is filled out with detailed descriptions of many of the virtues, as well moral as well as intellectual, the air of indeterminacy persists. We learn the names of the pairs of contrary vices that contrast with each of the virtues, but very little about where and how to draw the dividing lines or where and how to fix the mean. As Sedgwick says, Aristotle, only indicates the whereabouts of virtue. So, it tells us to be generous, but it doesn't tell you, how much money you need to be donating if you have X amount of expendable income. How much of that expendable income ought you be donating to charity, for example? Whereas the utilitarians, they can work out a little math problem for you to figure out how much of your expendable income would meet your obligation, right, relative to your resources and circumstances, of course. So there's the objection. Virtue ethics, with its emphasis on character rather than guiding conduct, um, doesn't help us figure cases. It doesn't help us come up with a decision procedure for telling us what actions are okay or not okay or are obligatory. Right. So there's the objection. Um, Rosalind Hursthouse is a contemporary virtue ethicist, and she takes her point of departure from Aristotle, which we've been talking about. And so you read for today Normative Virtue Ethics, her little excerpt from her book on normative virtue ethics, which is a full length uh, book treatment in defense of virtue ethics. And there's a section in there that's been excerpted for this essay where she addresses the no clear standard or the indeterminacy objection. So let's go through a few passages and get out her basic response to the objection here. You can imagine someone arguing along the following lines: if virtue ethics fails to provide an adequate standard to guide right conduct, then it fails as a moral theory. Virtue ethics, the golden mean, doesn't provide us with a decision procedure, so therefore it's not an adequate moral theory. So, we're going to think here about how Hursthouse would respond to that argument. So, a few passages from the excerpt. Right action. What grounds might someone have for believing that virtue ethics cannot tell us what we should do? She begins with that basic question posed in terms of that objection. And then she discusses some different accounts of right conduct from some of the theories that we've been looking at this semester. So we've looked at act utilitarianism, and it says that an action is right if and only if it promotes the best consequences. The best consequences are those in which happiness is maximized. Deontological right action, an action is right if and only if it is in accordance with the correct moral rule or principle. A correct moral rule or principle is one that um, we got a couple of options here. First is on the following list, and then we enumerate a list, or two is laid down by God in case of a divine command theory, or is universalizable in terms of the categorical imperative, or would be the object of the rational choice of all beings, and so on. So again, the third formula, the categorical imperative, legislation is a kingdom of ends, right? Rational beings self-legislating together. So those are all, just a rehearsal of some of those decision procedures from moral theories that we've already been looking at. And then she goes on. She says, but if the question is how can virtue ethics specify right action, the answer is easy. According to one version of virtue ethics, an action is right if and only if it's what a virtuous agent would characteristically do in those circumstances. Remember, Aristotle's about habitual behavior, and to have a virtue is to have it as a habit, right? A steady disposition. A virtuous agent is one who acts virtuously, that is, who exercises the virtues. And then a virtue is a character trait that, and again, depending on which version of virtue ethics, you might fill that out differently. So, as she notes here, the second premise of virtue ethics might, like the second premise of some versions of deontology, be completed by simple enumeration, or we might interpret Hume of the second inquiry as espousing virtue ethics. He was a sentimentalist, but also thought about virtues, either make yourself or useful to character traits that are useful to yourself or to others. According to him, a virtue is a character trait that is useful or agreeable to its possessor or to others, right? And then the standard Neo-Aristotelian version, which is the one we're more familiar with since we covered Aristotle, that a virtue is a character trait that human beings are required to have in order to achieve eudaimonia, or that's required for eudaimonia, or human flourishing, or living well, however you want to say that. That notice of excellence and with regard to the human function, like we talked about last time from Aristotle. So she goes on, here then is the specification of right action, whose structure closely resembles those of act utilitarianism and many forms of deontology. Given that a virtue ethicist can come up with such a specification, can it still be maintained that it cannot tell us what we should do? Does the specification somehow fail to provide guidance in a way that the other two theories do not? If we don't want to, if we want to know how a virtue ethics guides action, we have to identify what the virtuous agent would do. So, as you recall, when I introduced virtue ethics in the first lecture, I talked about one way of understanding what this theory is about is to come up with, a list of character traits that you have to have in order to be an ideally virtuous agent. However, you want to fill that out, right? Aristotle's got his version, but we just started with, how you would think about that, right? And then what would that person do if they were in, the murder at the door scenario? What virtues would be relevant there? Saving life, the value of life, generosity to your friend, wanting to maintain your friendships, of course, but also not wanting to, commit undue harm for people and others and be a friend to everyone, or as many people as we can be. Right. So, what virtues, courage might be required there, ingenuity might be required there to come up with a creative solution. So, you return the chainsaw, but maybe it doesn't work to do what you want it to do. Right. What would the virtuous person do in the murder at the door scenario or the trolley problem? And sometimes maybe the virtuous person would act similarly to a deontologist or a utilitarian, but the way in which they determine that is going to be grounded in the virtues and the character traits rather than kind of like an algorithmic decision procedure like we got out of those other two theories. So she says here, the above response to the objection that virtue ethics fails to be action guiding clearly amounts to the denial of the oft repeated claim that virtue ethics does not come up with any rules. Another version of it, though, is that it's concerned with being rather than doing. I've talked about the good rather than, the good for moral theories, or being versus doing, right, or acting, character versus action, in the emphasis of different moral theories, and needs to be supplemented with rules. So maybe that's what we need to do, is just supplement virtue ethics with some rules. We can now see that virtue ethics comes up with a large number of these sorts of rules. Not only does each virtue generate a prescription, act honestly, charitably, justly, but each vice a prohibition, do not act dishonestly, uncharitably, unjustly. Once this point about virtue ethics is grasped, and it's remarkable how often it's overlooked, can there still be any reason for thinking that virtue ethics cannot tell us what to do? So, there's her basic response, right? Is there that it does come up with um, a guide for action. It's grounded in the virtues, and those virtues can generate rules. So next up, she says, well, she considers a possible objection. Yes, she says, the reason given is roughly that those rules, act honestly, do not act uncharitably, etc., are like the rule, do what the virtuous agent would do, still the wrong sort of rule, still somehow doomed to fail to provide action guidance supplied by the rules or the rule of deontology and utilitarianism, right? So she says, but why is that exactly? Why are those rules better than the V rules, which she is going to give a label to here? She says, but how so? She says it's true that the rules of virtue ethics Henceforth, V rules, right, virtue rules, are couched in terms or concepts which are certainly evaluative in some sense or senses of that difficult word. In other words, it's not grounded in a non moral fact or some non moral truth. It's grounded in some kind of evaluative claim itself. So is it this that which dooms them to failure? Surely not, unless many forms of deontology fail too. If we concentrate on the single example of lying, defining lying to be asserting what you believe to be untrue with the intention of deceiving your hearers, then we might for a moment preserve the illusion that the deontologist rules do not contain evaluative terms. Sometimes it's thought that, utilitarianism is grounded not in evaluative terms, just in pleasure or pain, or that deontology is grounded in the fact or the truth that we are rational beings, right? And then just from the sheer non-moral fact that we're rational beings, somehow deriving um, morality or an evaluative claims from that. So that's what she's addressing here. She says, but as soon as we remember that few deontologists will want to forego principles of non-malfeasance or of beneficence, the illusion vanishes. For those principles and their corresponding rules, do no evil or harm to others, help others, promote their well being, etc., rely on terms or concepts which are at least as evaluative as those employed by virtue ethics. So, if that's a problem for one of these theories, virtue ethics, it's going to have to be a problem for all of them since they share that common feature. So, at least in that regard, virtue ethics, according to Hursthouse here, is not on worse ground than deontology or utilitarianism. So she proceeds on then. So we can see that virtue ethics not only comes up with rules, the V rules couched in terms derived from virtues and vices, but further, it doesn't exclude the more familiar rules we get from deontology. The theoretical distinction between the two is that the familiar rules and their applications in particular cases, like that murderer at the door, or the trolley problem, or the surgeon, are given entirely different backings. According to virtue ethics, I must not tell this lie since it would be dishonest, and dishonesty is a vice, and must not break this promise since it would be unjust or betrayal of friendship. Perhaps the available virtue and vice terms do not neatly cover every contingency simply because no virtuous person would. So, for example, you want to, keep your friend's promise to the murderer at the door, but you also don't want to um, be involved in committing undue harm to, or even possibly a murder. So the do no harm, is that going to trump the betrayal of the friendship there or not? Or would it be a betrayal of the friendship? If it's a real friendship, your friend probably wouldn't ask you to help him commit a murder in the first place. That doesn't sound like things virtuous persons would do with each other, right? So it looks like virtue ethics is able to come up with something of a response there. So, ex hypothesis, or from the hypothesis, a virtuous agent is one who is honest, charitable, etc., acts justly, and not doesn't act dishonestly, uncharitably, or unjustly. So, given the enumeration of virtues, remember that big list we had from Aristotle, I may well have a perfectly good idea of what the virtuous person would do in my circumstances, despite the fact that I might not be perfectly virtuous. I can still pick those things out, even if, in some cases we don't get a single answer. And that's kind of one of the upshots of virtue ethics as opposed to the others. We often want a single solution to a moral dilemma, but it may be the case that moral problems that are real dilemmas don't have a single solution the way that there is, a single solution to the question of how 2 plus 2 equals 4, right? Morality is not math in that way. It's not there's a difference between that sphere of life and just pure mathematics, right? So there's a little bit on how virtue ethics can try and respond to that objection from Mackey. So I hope that helps clear some of this up. We can recap it just a little bit here by, adding how we would apply virtue ethics. What are the virtues required to be an ideally virtuous agent? We know what Aristotle's would be, right? What are the relevant facts of the circumstances and the context and the action? So, yeah, it was my friend that I'm making the promise to, the murderer at the door, but there's this stranger here. I don't want to have anything to do with, strangers getting harmed for reasons that aren't clear to me, especially when they look innocent, right? So don't harm innocents, don't help people harm innocents. What virtues would be most relevant in the context of that decision? So, prudence, having the courage to stand up for something that looks like is wrong, that's occurring, that other people might be doing, would be relevant there. And then what rules of conduct could we derive from that? Again, maybe the virtuous agent would come up with a creative solution here and disable the chainsaw. So, here's your chainsaw. It's just not going to work to cut this person up. Um, so, maybe that's what the virtuous agent would do, is come up with a creative solution that allows him to return the chainsaw, but to not be involved in harming that other person. So we can think about, how the ideally virtuous agent might come up and deal with at least some of those sorts of issues, um, even if it doesn't provide us a nice, clear algorithmic decision procedure for addressing moral dilemmas. And so there's a little bit about that objection and how Hursthouse tries to respond to it. Hope you learned a little bit out of this video, and I will see y'all in class. Y'all have a good one.